Hi, I'm Kelly Bawden, and I'm here with the one and only lovely and talented Frank Bender, who just blew my mind with his talk about ELL evaluation. And thank you, Frank, for doing that.
Oh, no problem.
And as we were talking a little bit before we got started about, I have a placement right now that has a really wide variety of languages, and I'm doing all the evaluations. And so this is a great topic for me at this moment in my career. So I'm especially appreciative. So one thing that really struck me throughout what you were talking about is how this process is really, truly what we should be doing for every kid, right?
Yeah, it's funny. When I've done this workshop many times across the country, I try to express that. And I think when people have that aha moment, I think that's when I know I've done my job, because really, we should be doing this, in my mind. This is the process approach that would work for any student.
Right, exactly.
And this is why I think people sometimes, when they struggle with this concept of evaluating culturally and linguistically diverse students, I have found that what paralyzes the process and people are three things typically. It's usually there's fear, and the fear is based upon, I'm just scared to do the wrong thing.
Right.
And it's a fear of like, okay, again, I said in my discussion, is this different from what I typically do? And what I always try to convey to people is like, if we think of it more conceptually, it shouldn't be any different. What's different might be a couple of pieces of data that we consider and our analysis of how we filter our data through the lens of cultural and linguistic factors.
Right.
So,
and I think, you could easily apply any of that really to kiddos from extreme poverty, let's say, who they're in some ways we know from all the research, they're linguistically deprived in terms of their vocabulary exposure and things like that. And so, you could really apply it to any given population. And there's just the big picture here is that kids are they're more than a number, right?
Well, exactly. And this, it's interesting you bring up the students from poverty, because when we talk about dynamic assessment, and I'm a big proponent of dynamic assessment principles and the utilization of that approach to identify how a student learns, retains, and transfers information. So if we think about a student from poverty and how it's analogous to maybe working with our ELL population, what I'm trying to get at in my evaluation using this practice is if the child who either comes from a language-deprived environment or they are somebody who's just learning the language-based skills of English,
sure,
what happens when I teach them the skill set that they are lacking in?
Right.
And then, just like I would hope to see in my intervention with children that are already on my caseload, if I see a child who responds to that instruction very efficiently, meaning they retain that information pretty quickly, they're able to build upon that skill set and then transfer it to the next session, then those are the attributes of what I refer to as kind of that cognitive wiring that is in place that would be more reflective of a student that is typical versus atypical.
Right. And as you said, I love that you get those kiddos in your room, and boy, after 3 sessions, you're like, holy smokes, you have disordered language. Oh my word. You can't learn. You can't retain.
Exactly.
Oh boy. And then also, unfortunately, what happens, you also get those students sitting across from you, and you sit down and you teach them whatever you teach them, prepositions, and they've got it in one session. And you're like, super, we made you special ed eligible, and actually you just needed a little direct instruction.
And this is why I always go back to, I think that if we think about standardized measures, which have their place, but they are static versions of what the child can do in that moment in time. And the child's never been exposed to those concepts, and especially in a language other than their first language,
Right.
then it's not truly representative of what the child's knowledge or ability to learn is.
Right. Right. Exactly. And the standardized tests, they are, well, they're beaten into us in grad school. I've been out of grad school for a while, so maybe things are a little bit different now, but it's certainly what we're taught to hang our hat on. And that comes from grad school, and it comes from top down administration, and, it comes from lawsuits and
Right.
Congress and whatever. But, and also I think there's this comfort there that there's a number, and like, I know I can say, like, look, this is the number.
Right.
And one of the reasons I think that this kind of assessment that you're talking about, it's a little unnerving because it's squishy, and it's squishy and it's globby, and you can't quite, there's no number you can't say. But really, looking at that number, you can't actually say that.
Well, and I always go back to that, because if I've given a standardized norm reference test for an ELL student, and so let's say it's a Vietnamese student, and they've been referred, and they've been here for 2 years, and in an English-speaking school setting. So let's say they were in kindergarten, they came in, now it's kindergarten, first grade, early second grade, and I give them the told, or the castle, or the self, and they score low. Let's say they score 75 composite. I mean, so is that really telling me anything other than they just don't speak English very well?
Right.
I mean, that's really all it's telling me.
Right.
And when we think about the norm reference test is basically looking at, the 10,000 people that they designed it on, and whether the child is, performing worse than, the mean of 68% of the population. And that's all it's supposed to really tell us. And I always go back to my graduate school experience with Dr. Rhea Paul. And it's like, the standardized test is just telling you where the student performs compared to the normal distribution of the population.
Right.
It's not supposed to tell us that the child has a disability or disorder. But because I think policy issues, like you said, lawsuits, the districts that are looking for more efficient ways to identify a student, and a number seems to be pretty clear and concrete, people gravitate to that. This process is more squishy. But I think what people would find if they conducted this process is when you triangulate your data and you have information from a good, solid parent interview. And I tell you, most ELL evaluations, the part where most people drop the ball is a good, solid developmental history.
Right.
And if we went back to putting more time into that, and the research supports this, that you would find that the descriptions from the parent, if the child was developing in a slower, atypical way, in terms of their primary language, you would also see those other attributes if the child really was delayed or disordered in those other platforms or constructs that I mentioned. You would see it unfold in the second language acquisition. You would see it unfold in response to intervention.
Right.
And then you would most likely, if we were to use those standardized measures and probably use Dr. Ortiz's cultural language interpretive matrix, you would also see that pattern unfold as well. So when we triangulate all of that information, that's what we're really trying to do, is then say, look, I've looked at all the data. Is there a preponderance of evidence, not a number, but a preponderance of evidence that suggests that this child is not performing in a typical manner? And have I addressed those key components? Is it due to second language acquisition? No, because I've looked at that.
Right.
Is it due to the cultural variables of acculturation? No, I've looked at that. And if I can say I've looked at those two pieces of information and I cannot attribute it to the delays that this child is experiencing, and I've triangulated all those factors, then I should be able to say, yes, there isn't a number, but this child represents characteristics of a communication disorder based upon these facts or these factors. And if I go into a due process hearing and the hearing officer asks me, Mr. Bender, what did you do to determine that this child had a communication disorder? And if I walk in and say, well, Your Honor, this is a Somali student, so I gave the self 5,
Yeah.
and he scored 65, and so we made him eligible.
Right.
And the hearing officer is going to ask what the federal law asks us to do. Did you look at other factors? And if I don't say yes, or if I didn't consider those, I'm going to get in trouble. But if I said, yes, I did look at all those factors, and we didn't come up with a number, but we came up with like this error pattern that reflected atypical development, I'm going to walk out of there fine.
Sure, exactly. And
I'm going to sleep well at night.
Right, right. And you're going to know, I think that, with gigantic caseloads and as you know, and I know, the pressures on the school SLP are the demands are completely unrealistic and insane when you really want to do what's best for kids.
Right.
And this sort of thing. But that's where I love where you pointed out that, like, how much time are you putting into giving the self?
Well, and that's the part. People say, I don't have time to do this.
Right, right.
Now, I can do a full-blown evaluation for an ELL student in about the same amount of time as I can for an English-based student.
Yeah, I'm doing one right now for a Russian-speaking student, and she, the district wants some standardized tests, and so I'm giving, a couple of those, and at the same time doing dynamic assessment, and so I'm just tacking the extra 5 minutes of the teaching.
Right.
Into when she's in there already, and it's like sort of rapport building, and we're chit-chatting and doing that piece. It's adding a nominal amount
rich
of time.
data. Rich, yeah. I would say, going to what you just described, where the district requires a standardized test, I then start asking questions like, okay, do I have to give this? Because
I love that too. Yeah, that really made me think, and I don't know the answer to that. And what we have to get, this is a district process that has to be addressed higher up than most line level staff members. But if we think about this as a process approach that a district can then embrace, the question should be, what data do we need? Not that Kelly or Frank has to give the standardized test, but if we require a standardized measure, because the state of Oregon does require a standardized measure for communication disorder. Now, the question then becomes, in terms of meeting the requirements of the law, the issue shouldn't be me giving the test. It should be me doing the analysis of the test in terms of language-based issues. So if I can take a standardized measure that was already completed on this student in terms of, let's say it was a language proficiency test like the Woodcock-Munoz, right,
which has a language component to it. And this goes beyond this discussion, but I have the knowledge and the ability to interpret the Woodcock-Munoz in accordance to second language acquisition. In fact, the Woodcock-Munoz and the Woodcock-Johnson battery tests were developed to incorporate the 5 stages of second language acquisition. Mm-hmm. The trick is that you have to know what that looks like and how to interpret that.
Right.
But the point is that since I know how to do that, I can take that information that's a standardized test, I can interpret that, and I can fold that into my report and my analysis. So then I can the trick is knowing how to map my resources.
Right.
Like, if I know what data is out there and I can pull it, I can do my analysis, but I don't have to give the test. My job should be in the analytical piece of determining whether a child has some type of language disability. It's not me giving the PPVT. I mean, I don't want to upset people, but if you look at the PPVT examiner's manual, more than the speech pathologist can administer that tool.
Right.
It's not necessarily, the critical piece isn't me giving the test. The critical piece is me interpreting it through the lens of communication issues.
Right. And I think when you're talking about the back end stuff, when you're writing your report, I mean, if you are, hopefully people are noting that this is an English language learner and
yes,
and all of that in their report. And so you're already going to be talking about that stuff, I mean, although I do say, hopefully you are, and many reports come across my desk that don't mention that, which is unfortunate.
Well, it should not only mention that, but this is the part where I go back into, I wasn't able to go into a great amount of detail, but I mean, this is where I'm noting if I have to report a standardized test score because the district is requiring me to, I put right in there, this is not.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah.
I put an asterisk, like,
yes,
in my little chart, because I get a report and what do? I flip. What are the numbers? Okay. And then maybe I read the narrative, maybe I don't.
Right.
But so in my little chart, I put asterisks by every single score. And then I have my whole explanation too, because I don't want any, it's really important that we're not hanging our, I think
it's a professional approach that we have to note that, look, we know that, and we need to reflect that these scores for an ELL student are biased based upon cultural and linguistic issues. But this is where then I go into, because I know how to do this, but I then cite, and I'll cite the source, just like APA style, I cite Dr. Sam Ortiz's research, and I then provide an analysis of using the cultural language interpretive matrix. So for example, for his matrix for, let's say, the self 5, and he has, using his matrix, I'm able to then identify for every subtest how much my standard scores are being impacted due to language loading or language demand and cultural loading. So then I put a separate analysis saying that even though this child scored a 72, right, maybe based upon the cultural language interpretive matrix, this child's score, based upon the profile that Ortiz uses, may only fluctuate by 10 points, let's say. So that would then say that, okay, well, this score is biased by as much as 10 points. So my conceptual mean now goes from 100 standard score to 90.
Sure.
Okay, so now where does this student fall in terms of his score? He scored a 72. That is only 8 points from this 22 points, right? No,
I'm not good at the maths, Frank. I'm like a speech pathologist.
I'm with you. So 90, right? So then we have 80. There's 10. 10 plus another 8. 18 points. So we have the new conceptual mean is 90 because there's a fluctuation of 10 points. And this child scored a 72. So now I can say in my analysis, this test or subtest is inherently biased. However, when using the Ortiz Cultural Language Interpretive Matrix, APA citation, I love it. I didn't make this up. This student is performing even more discrepant than we would expect on this subtest. So then that gives credence to my analysis saying, look, if I go into a due process hearing, I know this test is biased. However, I'm using an approach that's in the research that says I'm taking into consideration the amount of bias and variability that is impacting my scores due to language and acculturation. And now I can say whether this student falls within that range. So maybe a 72 isn't that bad.
Right.
So now I can say, look, maybe based upon the profile, because Ortiz gives like 3 profiles, and based upon the profile of the student, it'll tell you how much variability exists within each subtest. So the most extreme case would be a student is what he refers to as, I can't remember the term that he uses off the top of my head, but it's basically it's a child who, let's say, has very limited exposure to English and their BIC skills. It's called markedly different. So if a child is markedly different, according to Ortiz's profile, and it is in the quadrant for most of our tests of the SELF or the PPVT, a child who's markedly different, their standard score points could be impacted by as much as 30 standard score points.
That's nuts.
Right, it's crazy, right?
That's nuts.
So on the surface, most of our test scores would be like, oh my goodness, I mean, they're totally invalid. However, what happens, and I've had this, child was I gave the PPVT was used, and it was a markedly different student, which means they had limited BIC skills, they had limited exposure in terms of the English language continuum, in terms of they've only been in the system for a very short time. So based upon that profile, you could see a range between 20 to 30 standard point score, 20 to 30 standard points variance in terms of the scores. Mm-hmm. So that would mean then my conceptual mean could shift from 100 to as far as 70.
Right.
Correct? Okay, so now what happens if the child scores a 75? Well, then I would say, when I'm reporting my scores, well,
they're rocking it.
Well, or they're within the range of what we would concern. It wouldn't be as atypical as people would think.
Right.
I'm real careful how I phrase things. You know, I don't say normal. I don't say abnormal. I just talk about typical and atypical.
Sure. Right.
But what happens if the child scored a 50? Now I can say,
sure,
yes, this test is it has issues with validity because of the bias of language and acculturation. And based upon the cultural language interpretive matrix outlined by Ortiz, APA citation, right? This score can vary as much as 30 standard score points. However, this child scored, a standard score of 50, which is significantly more discrepant,
right,
than we would expect in terms of how much bias is associated with this test.
Right. And I'm gonna go look up that tool because I'm gonna do my APA citation in my report that I'm gonna write this week for my student.
That tool and is based upon that book, The Essentials of Cross-Battery Assessment, and it comes with a disc, which is great.
Oh, cool!
Now you put in the disc, and it's actually, just so everybody knows, that it's primarily programmed for a PC, and the
lame.
I know, right? But if you have a PC, access to a PC like in your school, it's just more efficient to use because the way it's programmed. But you can put it in, and it's great for school psychologists in terms of using what they call the patterns of strengths and weaknesses model, which is awesome. But it also has, I'd say, about 20 different speech and language tests that you can pull up. And what it does, it brings up this grid, and you put in your scores, and then it gives you basically a pattern analysis of which groups of subtests are below where they should be or within the range. And then you can do your specific subtest analysis in terms of where the breakdowns are.
That's awesome. And, this reminds me, are any of those books that you mentioned resources, do you know if they're available on Amazon or
they all are.
So what's really cool, now wait for this is awesome. We can embed all of that into our podcast post. And so people can just go to the post on our blog, and it'll all be right there, and you can order it directly from Amazon right on our website.
Well, then what I will do is provide the direct titles and links to these.
Thank you.
So people can go, and I'll put down kind of my top few books that I would recommend.
Cool. That's the first time we're going to get to do that. So I'm super duper excited.
And there are a lot of resources out there, and the part that makes this whole process, it can be, if you let it can be overwhelming.
Sure.
I would say that any time that you're going down this path of trying to change your kind of assessment approach, or maybe from even a policy and procedure standpoint at a district level, is, start off and chunk what you can accomplish. If you try to do the whole thing at once, it'll be overwhelming.
Right. And maybe, it's enough. It's enough if you're not familiar with this at all. It's enough just to write in your report, this student is an English language learner, and this test was standardized on native English speakers. Yeah. That's a great place to start.
It's a great place to start.
Even if you do that can be your baby step for this year. And then, the next, and certainly, like I said, the placement I'm in right now, holy smokes, it's super duper linguistically diverse.
Right.
But I have gone, literally I've gone I think the last time I did one of these was a couple years ago,
right.
So depending on where you're at, you're either going to do this all the time or you're like never going to do it.
Well, exactly. And I think I was starting down this path earlier, talking about, how efficient I can do this in about the same amount of time. But for somebody who's just starting out, it's going to take longer for a couple of reasons. One, you may not have the knowledge of how to do the interpretation at a proficient level yet. And I always explain this to people in terms of, do you remember when you came out of graduate school?
Vaguely.
Well, okay. But do you remember did it take you longer to do evaluations and write reports and do your analysis?
Oh, yeah, right.
Than it does today?
Totally. Of course it does.
Right. And this is the same thing, right? Because you now know, in terms of just a standard English evaluation, you know where to find information. You have that ability to do the analysis very efficiently and make those kind of connections. When I'm asking people to do now is think about second language acquisition, which they may not have a great deal of background or knowledge on yet. So then that requires them to do some additional research and get some insight. So that takes longer. But once you do these things and you systematize the process, it will be like anything else. Your proficiency level will increase and your time to do this will decrease.
Right. And it's the same thing like with writing your report. When the first time you write a report, you don't know like, how do I write that up? And I'm not quite sure. And then, you do it about 452 times and you have your report template and you pull it up and you grab your standard language out of there. And I think this is sort of the same thing where even if your baby step is just that you're going to add that little caveat, type it up, make it look how you want, and then you can cut and paste that into your other reports.
Exactly. I would say that, if people are taking these baby steps, I think, like you mentioned, a first step is one, just to, note in your report that, you're working with a bilingual student and what that looks, and identify in writing the report, this is the student's cultural, linguistic kind of profile. Now, what would be great then is to provide some additional insight to what that means. What's typical about that, or what's atypical, or what's typical. The other piece I think I would encourage for anybody, and this, like we mentioned earlier, this should be no different from any evaluation, but for our ELL students, even more so important, I believe, because we don't have standardized measures, is a strong developmental history.
Right.
What we know about students that are bilingual that have communication disorder is that the disorder and disability will exist in both languages.
Right. And so talking to mom, and mom says, oh, no, he didn't talk till he was 3.5. Well, okay. Winner, chicken dinner.
Right. It's a red flag. I always think in terms of what I call red flags. Like, how many red flags have to be present, before I'm like, okay, something's going on here.
Right. Yeah. So there's definitely that developmental history is huge. So, and this will be my last question because, we do have other things to do today, right?
Oh,
but
right. I could go on all day on this.
I know. So you want to do that developmental history, but you don't have anybody who can talk with mom, who speaks that language. Mom doesn't read English or write English or any of that. Like, do you have any super duper advice for overcoming those sorts of barriers?
Well, one thing I would say is that one of the things that does make this process a little bit longer is that more than likely you will need the assistance of an interpreter.
Yes, you do.
Now, it is the district's responsibility, and it is a state law in the state of Oregon that districts are to provide an interpreter for any kind of services related to education for parents to have informed consent or to be a part of the educational process. And there is a state statute, I don't have it off the top of my head, but there's a state statute that reflects that. Now, what could happen is the district says, we can't get anybody.
Right.
Well, this is where you have to determine like how far you want to push, but they are required to provide support or assistance. And technology now allows us to get access to interpretation services in a way that we couldn't do 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Sure, right. Yeah, I didn't even think about that.
The key, you could be using phone conferences, webcasts. There are ways to go about it if a district thinks outside the box. But let's say a larger district, and for most districts, they may have a lot of EAs that are available for interpretation.
Yes.
And so you want to capitalize on it. What you want to try to avoid is like having family members or friends in the community assist with interpretation to talk with the parents about sensitive information.
Right.
And there's a great book, and I'll put this as one of the books that I recommend, by Lily Chang, and I can't think of her name, but it's on working with interpreters. And it's a great book to have because it really outlines the things that you want to consider. So if you have to do interpretation, you may have to work with an interpreter and to get the information that you need. What's important about working with interpreters, though, with people from different cultural backgrounds, is that you really got to think about your questions in terms of what are you trying to really ask? Like sometimes people just use a standard developmental history form and they don't think about the cultural sensitivities.
Right.
And we should think about cultural sensitivities for anybody, right?
Of course.
You know, do I, depending on the situation, do I really have to ask the parent if they, smoke crack? I mean,
right.
So you got to be thoughtful in terms of the questions that we ask. And with somebody who comes from a different culture, we have to be more aware that sometimes talking about pregnancy can be a sensitive issue.
That. Mm-hmm.
So then how do we address that? Well, if it's a question that you really need answered, you need to work with your interpreter to identify and say, I understand this is a sensitive topic. However, this is really important for us to know. And, using that interpreter will assist you in getting that information because then they have that kind of cultural reciprocity with the parent.
Right. And that's where, I try and think of my interpreters as not just linguistic interpreters, but they're really cultural interpreters. And that, when you find somebody great, you can really lean on them for some of that. And
this is what takes longer, because if you're working with an interpreter, you have to remember that any meeting you have with an interpreter will probably take twice as long.
At least.
So, because you're filtering information through another person and then back through you or back to you. So that takes time. But the other part that people typically don't do, and this can make or break the success of using an interpreter, is what you really need to front load some time in what the book that I'll recommend and have a link to is a process that they refer to as the BID process, the BID, which is now I've lost my now all these
whatever.
Anyway, basically the process is that you want to meet with the person initially, okay, and really establish what the context is going to be of the discussion. You want to talk about any potential sensitivities. You want to talk about the vocabulary that you may use with the interpreter in the exchange. Because sometimes with interpreters, this is where people don't always realize that because we use certain vocabulary in our discipline, it doesn't translate in other languages. Right? So you're working with an interpreter, and you might ask if the child has any learning challenges, but maybe learning challenges doesn't translate very well. So then the only thing that comes close with the interpreter, if you haven't prepped with them, is mental impairment.
Right. Or or they say something like retarded or, and but you don't have any idea any of that's happening except you look at mom's face and like she goes white and and then she wants to know if you think her child is retarded and you're like, oh my gosh. And
this is why we have to, BID stands for briefing, interaction, and debriefing.
Right.
It's the briefing part initially where you kind of establish the context, you calibrate your language that you're going to use and identify if there are any vocabulary words that might be misconstrued or maybe they don't translate very well. And because time is the enemy in everything that we do, it's challenging to do, but I can tell you from personal experience that if you don't do that debriefing or that briefing part and debriefing, you may find out that the information that person is communicating isn't as valid and reliable as you think.
Right, exactly. And you have, and just having those conversations about, okay, no, we're not going to say retarded. We're going to talk.
Right.
The idea I want to get to here is talking about, mental whatever it might be.
Whether this is a developmental history or part of a case history for your evaluation. I mean, the critical piece is like identifying what questions are essential that you need to know to provide insight to your evaluation. The other piece I would say, too, that we typically don't do a very good job at, I would say, I don't want to overgeneralize this, but we ask a question that inherently in the westernized world, most parents may already have a contextual framework for.
Mm-hmm.
So with our bilingual parents, many times it may not be as clear. And in some cultures, there's a sense of shame that might come with asking if your child is struggling.
Sure.
So instead of saying something like, is your child struggling with understanding Vietnamese at home? The word struggle might come like, well, the parent might think to themselves, well, I don't want to share that information. It's sensitive and it's embarrassing.
Right.
So then what you want to do is maybe contextualize it for the parent and say, if the child has a sibling, ask questions that are comparative. If, does the younger child understand more than the older child?
Yeah, that's a great, great tip. Mm-hmm.
So give them a contextual framework to draw from and give them examples. Because again, this could be important for not just our bilingual parents, but so some of our parents that might come from backgrounds that are socioeconomically diverse.
Sure. Yep.
Because I can tell you that a lot of times we talk, but we don't, I don't know if parents necessarily have true informed consent because we're using all of these fancy terms.
Oh my gosh, I think about that all the time.
Yeah, so
all the time.
It's relevant to, I think, any family, providing examples. And I've been in meetings before where it's been with English-speaking parents and the principals acting as our district representative, and I talk about some of the language-based struggles that the child has, and then I contextualize it to what that looks like at home and in the classroom.
Right.
And I can tell you the aha that the principal has, like, oh my gosh, I never knew that that's what that meant.
Right. Right. Yeah, I know. And it comes down to being a good communicator, right? It all comes back to communication.
It all does. So,
yeah.
I appreciate, I know you probably have to close this down, but I know there's so much more that people will want information on. I'll provide some links to what I think are some very strong resources in terms of assisting with this process.
And maybe you can come back and do another one.
Yeah, if I came back and did another one, or maybe more than one, I think having maybe a separate one, I think I'd like to talk more specifically about what does second language acquisition look like?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because I think that knowing those attributes of second language acquisition, again, goes back to helping us understand what typical and atypical look like. I think having a discussion on dynamic assessment.
Yes, that would be great.
Would be helpful. And then maybe even having like a little discussion of, looking at the cultural language interpretive matrix of Dr. Ortiz's and how that applies to speech pathology and how we can use that information to give us some insight.
Yeah, well, okay. Let's make a plan.
Make a plan.
Well, thank you so much, Frank.
Okay, no worries. I appreciate the time.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.